Hi. Very good afternoon to everyone here. Thanks for the government of Telangana, government of Goa and Nucleus Vision for having all of us. I just want to start by saying, it was great to see the various perspectives you can have on a single issue. When you walked into the room to discuss this before the panel discussion, we found, large varieties of perspectives in just the same topic. For example, the way we look at it, as especially as NITI Aayog as a government body, how I'm thinking about regulations and laws is very different from how Oz or, Josh are. And this is something that we want to bring up. And so right at the outset, what I'm going to say is that we're not going to be talking too much about ICOs or the legality of ICOs. What we are going to be talking about is the underlying blockchain technology and how laws and regulations affect the implementation of that. And also blockchain as a cryptocurrency and how laws and regulations affected in its implementation as a cryptocurrency. Now, as NITI Aayog, what my perspective is pretty much in line with what we've been hearing, from various governments since morning. When you talk about land records, for example, and when you actually get down to trying to implement a pilot, you find the major encumbrances are legal, right? The fact is that the technology exists to put this on a smart contract. The technology exists to sort of automate this transaction and make it super smooth, remove all intermediaries. But the fact is, there are a number of laws, right from the RBI to the SEBI to IT Act, which simply don't even allow you to digitally sign stamp duty today. You need to go take a hard copy to the office. And these are things that have been built up over many, many years, and it will take time for them to change. But this is the perspective that I come from. But when you speak to Josh and Oz and all these guys, you realize what different countries across the world are facing and how very different a perspective it is, how they're communicating with governments across the world to try to define these frameworks in a more concrete way to sort of allow proliferation of this technology. So first, I think I'd like to invite Zakir to sort of help define or try to demystify really, because what you see is RBI stance is slightly gray, but demystify RBI stance on cryptocurrency and blockchain as a whole, and sort of help us understand and set the
Thanks
context.
a lot for that. I think, the mandate of this conference, as I heard in the morning, was that we need to kind of clear the clouds and demystify as to what the regulatory stance is in India. From my perspective as a lawyer, I look at it in a very simple, plain way. I see two very important limbs which are moving, and they're moving simultaneously. One is a limb where there is active involvement of the government. That is the space where the government is adopting DLT technology. Now, I know that is something which the government is doing at a very fast pace and is going on really well. But my personal sense is that is 10% of what the entire blockchain ecosystem is all about. So if you ask me what is the impact of the law in that vertical, it's fairly clear. When the government is involved, it's generally a private blockchain. So issues relating to data privacy, issues in relation to normal principles of contract and other principles which are well settled. The second limb is where we would perhaps tread into dangerous waters in this current atmosphere. That is where public blockchain projects are in play. My view is that this is the actual space where most countries in the world are struggling in terms of regulation. And I don't want to talk about cryptocurrency, but I want to explain to this audience that the current RBI notification which has been issued, that does not really ban cryptocurrency per se. It is just an advisory in the form of a notification to the banks which are governed by the RBI and other intermediary bodies who have been licensed by the RBI to transact in terms of fiat for buying currency, virtual currency. This has been challenged before the Supreme Court by way of a clutch of petitions which were filed all across India. And now, finally, it's been heard in the Supreme Court. Popular perception is that, the ban is in place. Yes, it is in place. There is no stay which has been granted. But the Supreme Court is yet to decide on this very important point. And that is something which we will be seeing in September. So, to hold cryptocurrency is not something which is illegal per se at this point in time. It's purely a advisory to the banks which are in play. Now, that is on the cryptocurrency side, but from a legal perspective, I look at this as perhaps an impediment in terms of innovation which is there in the blockchain ecosystem. And the reason why I say this is that if an individual would want to actually develop a decentralized app, and if he doesn't have access to, let's say, Ether, there is innovation which is just out of the door. So India has taken a back step in terms of immediately just putting in place a very simple restriction. Second impact, if you want to participate in an international blockchain project, we have got immense talent in India. That talent would generally participate by issuance of some tokens which is being given to a developer pool. If it's been issued overseas, how would an individual in India bring those tokens into the country and convert it into fiat? So right away we are cutting off an individual's recourse to a very high level of employment, and India has a tremendous set of talent in that sense. The third biggest impact is, I think, in terms of fundraising. Tokens are exactly the meat in the game. If a developer pool is not incentivized, there is no innovation. So I'm not talking about cryptocurrency, but placing this ban in place is actually affecting the innovative side of India, and that's where we're being left behind. And I'm not criticizing this, but I think there is a balance which is required to be made between regulation as well as innovation. And cryptocurrency, yes, it can be regulated. There are several examples where it's low-hanging fruit. I think Japan is one of the best examples. They haven't recognized it as legal tender, but they can say that it's a mode of payment, but it's not a currency. Yeah. No sovereignty will want to replace their currency with something which is another kind of a token. So I think at the cost of innovation, which I think India would probably suffer or take a back seat, the government probably needs to, and private players, they need to start a dialogue to understand that blockchain has to work hand in hand in terms of token issuance.
Yeah, so we'll get to how the governments may be across. Right. So another discussion that you're having before the panel really was, is there any parallels with what we've seen in India before? Have we seen something like this, or seen a technology that's had to be regulated as such? And I think Gurdeep had a very interesting point as to how the telecom industry actually had very similar problems, and really try to highlight the opportunity that this sort of can highlight in the blockchain space as well.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. I'll sort of build on to what Zakir said. India in more ways than one in the past have been at the forefront or have leapfrogged whenever the opportunity has come to us. It basically comes on the back of strong fundamentals that this country has and the needs of this country. Largely rising on 1.2 billion over population, 2.6 trillion economy and growing very rapidly. More than half the population is young. There is a rise in millennials. And the 4G, which has become now ubiquitous, the internet is driving the new socio and economic layer, new ways of doing commerce. And we are seeing more and more generation now getting born on the internet, where the adoption is very fast and to the extent it is end-to-end. And we are also seeing the rise of entrepreneurs in India. Now, there are a lot more startups coming up. The ecosystem is friendly. We are seeing many companies move into the unicorn club. They're fundamentally rising on the back of technology adoption to the needs of India's information and infrastructure gaps. I mean, if we take the example of telecom industry where I come from, just because that industry regularly or on a periodic basis work together with government to create a positive framework that we now see today over 1 billion people using phone and making a call at the cost of less than 1 cent or maybe half a cent. I think we need to take cognizance of this change in the socio-economic framework that is taking place. And at the same time, there is a rising demand from every stakeholder across the society or in the business areas of high governance, transparency, and government in itself is doing its bit in delayering the processes, and putting more use of technology into every sphere and the sector that is possible. Two of the businesses that one I'm founder and another I'm a co-founder, which is Blink, where I'm a founder, and a co-founder is a Boldcoin, which is currently under the process of ICO, where Nucleus Vision is one of the investors, has adopted the blockchain right from the day one. In fact, Boldcoin has adopted the dual way, both of Ethereum and the Wave. I strongly believe, and I think I build on to what Jakir said, that it's the right time. We have seen this today, many MOUs being signed across the section of the industry, be it universities, be it the agriculture or a healthcare sector. This is the right time if across the sections of the society or the industry we come together in a positive atmosphere, work with the government to create a framework which can put India at the frontier of adoption of blockchain technology.
Yeah. Thank you, Gurdeep. I mean,
just to comment on that, India is not the only country that is seeing this. A lot of countries have similar profiles. They have young populations, they have high GDP, they have a lot of potential there. So, like it or not, India is in a race with other countries who are pushing forward to decide if they want to have a very good and attractive regulatory framework. So as you said, there is a lot of opportunity here, a tremendous amount of opportunity. So some other folks on the panel know a lot about regulatory frameworks across the world.
Jared, especially in terms of just the opportunity from an entrepreneur's perspective in you know.
Well, I started one of the early Bitcoin exchanges in the US in 2012, and right as I was starting the company, regulation started to come into play in the US. And depending on what state you were operating in, it really had a big effect on whether you were going to be able to raise capital easily. For instance, California was very accepting to crypto, and they were public about it, and you saw crypto companies be started in San Francisco rapidly. New York, on the other hand, started a what I would call a failed regulatory scheme called the BitLicense, which ultimately scared companies away from New York, and also, you know, made it very difficult for the companies who decided to stay to raise capital. I can't tell you how many venture capital conversations I had with investors who would say, well, I mean, what about this BitLicense thing? Are you going to be able to get one? And you know, ultimately, it took years for New York State to even create the BitLicense, and once they did, they didn't issue it to almost anyone. So we see this on a global scale. There are certain countries who promote accepting policies towards cryptocurrency. Companies are moving there right now en masse. Capital is flowing into those markets, and we see other countries do the opposite. And I think India in particular has a big opportunity ahead of it if it decides to publicly embrace cryptocurrency. What I can say as someone who lives in the United States is that the world is watching, and we are talking about it, about news that's coming out of India. And I really hope, even though I am personally a visitor to your country, you know, I have been fortunate enough to be able to work with a few teams based out of India, and I really hope that India decides to embrace companies that are starting in this industry, because we're watching. We could see billions of dollars flow into the economy here, which will create jobs and more prosperity.
Thanks. I mean, so now that we've gotten the sort of context, the opportunities, and perhaps more about the opportunities, I'd really like to open the floor to Jason, Oz, and Josh. Tell us about the experiences in other nations and how they're dealing with the same problems.
Well, I actually want to ask the audience a couple of questions to sort of gauge a couple of things here. How many of you are involved in, or just by a show of hands, are involved in or considering getting involved in an ICO or some sort of smart contract project? So roughly about a third of you. How many of you have invested in a project or purchased cryptocurrency in the past 2 years? Roughly about a third again. And how many of you are concerned about the regulatory landscape globally and need some clarification as to where things are going? Kind of about a third again. All right. So I'll throw a couple things out and then I'll toss it over to my colleague here. So in America, we have an organization called DATA, and what the United States government and a bunch of states had decided was that they're not necessarily qualified to be writing the legislation. And so what they've done, if you look at Wyoming, you look at Rhode Island, you look at Nevada, initially, you also look at what's coming out of Delaware, you have different state regulations coming about that are creating new and really interesting opportunities for companies to take advantage of a variety of different incentives that each state has to offer. Wyoming is trying to make itself free crypto state, very much like it did for credit cards maybe about 20, 30 years ago. Now, when you take this to a global perspective, you've got a lot more challenges, right? India had some guidelines against crypto previously that, they're starting to revisit. And, as our colleagues have talked about here, you've got a great opportunity in a country with 1.2 billion people and $2.6 trillion worth of, annual income to do something to actually create new value. And so I'll talk about three things real quick and then I'll pass the mic. One is, there's a group of us that are working on something called the Crypto Compliance Consortium. And if you're interested in finding out more about that, come and see me or grab me after this. Because one of the things that we're looking to do is to build some standards in between countries to say what's sort of like a fair playing field by which we can do business and we can allow new projects to proliferate. But let's take a look at what happened in Europe recently, not just GDPR, but Gibraltar. So Gibraltar was supposed to be the end-all be-all for creating new crypto projects. You had some changes in EU regulations, and all of a sudden everyone's going to Malta. If you look similarly to the east, we've got Singapore now becoming sort of the gateway for investments through China. And if you look to what's going on in my hemisphere, we've got Bermuda and Cayman becoming sort of the benchmarks for where you're creating foundations. Europe has still got Zug, but there's opportunities for new countries to kind of come into the mix here. And if you look at Mumbai, you look at Goa, right? You look even where we are in Telangana. There's an opportunity to look at what some of your older laws were and rewrite those in a matter and framework that are going to make it easy for the investment into crypto projects or smart contract projects, the leveraging of smart contracts to disintermediate old systems. Think about how many middleman brokered systems are here that could be disrupted. And the third is to look at new and weird technologies that are coming out in terms of, say, stablecoin or backed currencies. I mean, we just had, well, I don't know if I should talk about Stellar real quick, but in the United States, everyone was looking at Hyperledger real weird for a hot minute. And then all of a sudden, they went and partnered with Stellar, and the FDIC got into the mix, and all of a sudden you've got a backed stablecoin. So in addition to having this really broad crypto landscape that we're working in, we now have a corporate coin that could potentially be used in between industry and the burgeoning ICO market of entrepreneurship that's out there. So there's a whole bunch of changes afoot on a global perspective, and I'll just end cap there and toss it over.
Sure. So one of the things I wanted to kind of discuss was about the different frameworks different countries have used globally. So first I'll start with Gibraltar. So Gibraltar is kind of a neat little country in the south end of Spain. Tiny little place. I went there a couple days ago, back in February for a conference, and it was quite amazing, just a little kind of enclave on the edge of the Mediterranean. Anyway, with the blockchain technology laws in Gibraltar started 3.5 years ago. It's not something that's been cooked up overnight. What they basically did is took a page from the gaming industry, because Gibraltar is one of the premier licensee, or basically regimes that have licenses for online gaming. So back in the late 90s, when people started creating online casinos, Gibraltar stepped up and said, hey, we can basically put together a framework for you guys where you can have licensed online casinos. So they took some of the same lessons they learned from that, applied it to blockchain. And they have the first regime, basically, that started back in March of this year. Some of the drawbacks about that is every application has to go through basically the Financial Services Commission and be approved by the board. And what the difficult part is in Gibraltar is they want hearts and minds in Gibraltar. That means senior staff and management, your CEO, your CFO, resides in Gibraltar. And it's not a practical place for a lot of people to live. It's nice, but it's one of these places just kind of hard to get to. So Malta's kind of taken some of the thunder and away from Gibraltar on that. Singapore, just not too far from here, is basically the 4th largest ICO center in the world when you look as far as number of blockchain companies that have been registered there. Singapore has not created any laws. They haven't created any regulation. All they've done is basically the Monetary Authority of Singapore has given a few statements reaffirming that certain laws should be followed. That's all it is. And they've basically been working with the industry on a real kind of a collaborative basis in developing something. So they do have regulation that's coming, but industry and the Singaporean government have been working together to put this together. It's one of these interesting places, so you can actually call up the Monetary Authority of Singapore, go have a meeting with them, and talk to them about your project. And they will give you feedback into what we need to do here, how it works within the regulatory framework, and such like that. So it's quite good. So the regulator there hasn't changed laws or made laws, but they're accommodating within the existing structures. And the last one, my hometown, basically I live in Bangkok. So Thailand is the first country in Southeast Asia that has actually passed blockchain legislation. It's called the Digital Asset Act. And so the government 3 months ago passed this act, and they've been working together with the different departments to bring regulation forward so you can actually have licensed entities engaging in this space. So the Thai SEC has been basically working with industry. I have one of my guys, the CEO of one of my advisory firms. He's been at the SEC twice a week for the last 3 months, discussing with them, how they can actually make things work. And they're basically coming out with the new regulatory frameworks, and things are moving forward. So if you take a real kind of collaboratory approach and work with government in addressing these problems, it really works. Because the fact is, government sits in the background and they have the bureaucracy around it. And a lot of these guys may have an understanding how it works, but nobody wants to put their head on the line and make a big decision. So engaging with industry, engaging with bureaucracy, in creating a framework that works for everyone to basically protect all the shareholders and stakeholders involved is the way forward.
Thanks. Josh, do you have something to add?
Yeah, the last jurisdiction that has major regulatory framework out there is Malta. Malta has a few pieces that are interesting to it. One is it comprehensively regulates exchanges. Another is it has this weird voluntary registration process if you're running in sort of an innovative technology arrangement. And you can have this innovative technology arrangement audited, and you can get some sort of certification by the government of Malta. It's not entirely clear who would take advantage of this voluntary certification process. It does impose a lot of requirements on the innovative technology arrangement. So if you're a smart contract platform and you sign up for one of these certificates, you have to prove that you can make changes to the underlying platform, which is difficult for a decentralized system. So it's not clear how much the government of Malta then actually values decentralization. There's some policy implications to having that sort of setup. Malta, I think, realized it was in a race. Malta took the approach where they rushed to get something out. They had rounds of feedback, but the turnaround time between draft 1 and draft 2 and draft 3 of the regulation was very, very fast. So they, in the allegory of the tortoise and the hare, were the hare. If India is going to take an approach, I would counsel Indian government to be the tortoise, to go slow, steady, do it right, learn from the lessons of Gibraltar, Malta, and others, and really take advantage of everything that you said this country has to offer.
So yeah, towards the end of our pre-panel meeting, we posed the question, is there excessive regulatory sort of burden? And surprisingly, the answer was no. We need these frameworks, and we need to develop these regulations together with the government and the industry, and with strong channels of communication to sort of allow a system which benefits both parties but yet doesn't hurt the citizens or hurt the customers. And we've seen and heard of examples from all over the world. We've understood maybe the context of India itself, and the idea is now really to build these systems and build these channels and get this communication going so that we can define these frameworks, because we have done so before and we've done so well, and we can do so again. And we can, for this time, for blockchain, and this time to really help grow this ecosystem and let the technology flourish.
One other thing I want you all to think about too is, if you think back about 18 years, right, to the year 2000, India went through a massive amount of cultural and technological change in terms of accepting CMM, in terms of accepting ISO, in terms of shifting to become a economy that really drove and built development around the globe, right? Now, in the past decade, what's happened here is that you've had FinTech back office outsourcing of a majority of your big banks and big companies across the globe. I think moving forward from right now, you got to think about three things that are going to be necessary here. One is there's a cultural change here, okay? Because what blockchain does is it removes necessary middlemen inside of a process, makes it simpler and easier to do, and makes it more cost effective. By doing that, that's going to change a lot of the ways things operate here. Two is you have to think about capital. Capital previously was sourced by Indian development projects going across the globe and, building everything from trading systems to SAP implementations to, whatever Oracle was selling that year. And I think where you need to think now is, where is the capital coming from? India is a wealthy country. You've got your own family offices. You've got your own venture capital. And you've got a tremendous amount of companies here that are willing to put money into the next generation technology that's going to become smart contracts. But there needs to be a framework, and there needs to be leadership going into that. And then the last thing I'll really add to that is, and this can kind of go back to the entrepreneurship angle and a few other pieces, is that moving between now into the 2020s, you need to think about the same types of disruptive systems that really created some of your social entrepreneurship that everyone talked about in India previously. You have the opportunity for nano projects. You have the opportunity for micro projects, and you have the opportunity to take the 90,000 villages that are in this country that were just recently brought onto broadband, and figure out ways that you can leverage those systems to bring in blockchain technology that makes it really disruptive. And it's that disruptive factor that is going to give you the opportunity to do something huge. And at the same token, it's that disruptive factor that's going to be the catalyst that drives government regulation to help support it.
Okay. I think we have about a minute left, so I guess we can take maybe one or two questions from the audience.
I think maybe you want me to talk about a legal issue?
Anyone have questions?
Yeah. We have somebody here, yes. Maybe we can take one question, yes. So one second, just.
We heard a lot of new applications of blockchain, right? And finance, banking is heavily regulated in India, and actually we've done very well in banking as such. And we've seen, the biggest opportunity of blockchain is actually cryptocurrency and banking. And over a period of time, we feel that this is going to change, and one of the reasons I think banking is heavily regulated is, that there are a lot of money lenders, traditional money lenders who really used to siphon off and take a lot of things. So are we going to see some changes from a banking regulatory perspective, making it much easier? Because right now I think we see these applications in all the different aspects of blockchain, but very little in finance. Today I didn't see much in finance, so that was more of a question.
Yeah, I could probably get that one. I think the first question was talking about the number of kind of different applications around finance. I've seen lots of different kind of FinTech plays. So my law practice got into FinTech about 4 years ago, and blockchain's been last year and a half as kind of a subset of that. There's a lot of applications that I've seen people trying to develop D-apps or new platforms and stuff like that. It does, and it's fantastic stuff, but the fact is it doesn't need a token. So there's a lot of hype in the market, and a lot of people are trying to raise money for projects that really don't make sense for a proper use case on blockchain. A lot of people have been trying to build a use case so they can go out and do an ICO and raise some money. And it's cool, right? I understand that. But at the same time, a lot of these things don't really need to have blockchain behind it. You can't have the security and kind of the opaqueness that some of these financial systems require by having an open source system. People don't want to use it, so that's a bit of an issue. And maybe you get the second question.
I just wanted to add one thing. You can think about lightweight adoption and heavyweight adoption. Lightweight adoption is Santander Bank has partnered with XRP to roll out digital wallets. Now, what they're allowing is people to be able to transfer money to each other. But what they're doing is they're creating the future framework for when XRP and some of these other cryptos are actually accepted by banks. And consider this, Liechtenstein, it's as good as cash. Germany, it's as good as cash for certain types of transactions. And the EU is looking at this completely differently right now. In major parts of the world, you can travel, you could literally just go everywhere and pay in Bitcoin. So that's the lightweight adoption curve with banks. The heavyweight adoption curve is when it starts disrupting. You talked about money lending, okay? Usury is a huge problem in this part of the world. If you can think about one or two, Good Money is sitting out here. I'll give you an example, because he got stuck in customs. I'm just gonna give him a shout out. But take a look at Good Money, okay? Like the ability to actually lend inside of an ecosystem that could be, a nano transaction or a micro transaction. These types of systems need to not just be adopted by banking, but they need to be adopted in more of a cultural fashion, because those types of pushes saying, hey, we want these types of products, are really what's going to drive most of these large corporations to say either we have to offer this, or someone else is going to come into the market and provide that service.
Thanks. So I think we're done. I'd just like to thank all the panelists really quickly.
One question here.
So where are you? Can you please stand up?
Can you see the rightmost side?
Yeah. Yes, sir. Please go ahead.
Okay. You have discussed something about data protection and GDPR's effect on blockchain and cryptocurrency. Now, going forward this year, India is going to launch a Data Protection Act. So how do you see its impact on the blockchain regulation, and will it be an obstacle in blockchain implementation?
I think your question is more on data privacy, the impact of that, right?
Yes.
So the bad news is that already you are supposed to take care of the data privacy issues. EU GDPR is in flow, 25th May 2018, it's come into action. If you are an Indian developer dealing with any kind of a foreign enterprise where you are collecting some form of data, you have to be very, very careful about the law as to how it will impact you, because the penalties are very high. It could be 4% or 2% of your entire annual turnover. So it's very critical that apart from complying with India law on data privacy, you need to comply with EU GDPR, which is the bigger headache. So maybe in the private blockchain perspective, the right to forget is something which could be dealt with. But in a public blockchain, where anonymity is the crux of it, it's going to be a very big challenge and an issue as to how you will implement the right to forget in that sense. But one of the arguments is that if there is anonymous data which is not attributed to an individual, then perhaps the data privacy law may not be applicable in that first case. But that's a test case, that's an argument which needs to be tested. But definitely it's a very big issue for developers, apart from liability issues under your contract as to who will bear the risk in terms of a data breach.
Thank you, sir. Tanay, would you like to kind of wind up the panel or discussion here?
Just, thank you guys. Thanks everyone for coming down. Thanks for your insights. It was a pleasure.
Thank you very much to our moderator and panelists. A huge round of applause for them, ladies and gentlemen. Once again, expressing a gratitude to you all for joining us here for the panel discussion.